Last time, we considered the role of self-explanations in learning about math and science, and we ended with a somewhat skeptical look at the idea of discovery or inquiry-based learning. In this lecture, we'll continue to look critically at this approach to learning. It's a very popular idea, and it's worth, therefore, a bit of a continued critique. One reason that these approaches to learning that emphasize people doing their own theorizing and their own testing of their theories, one reason these approaches may fail or fall short of our expectations has to do with the model that they have about how learning proceeds. What is behind discovery-based learning is the notion that learning proceeds like science and that people are like intuitive scientists. They explore their environment, they generate ideas about how the world works, and then they go on and test those ideas. And after they test those ideas, they might adopt an altered model of how the world works that takes into account the results of the tests they've made. Well, what does it really mean? In science, broadly speaking, the accumulation of knowledge is hugely varied, and the way that I, for example, engage in science is not the way that the physicist down the hall does so. So really, there are three questions here. First, what do we mean by saying that people are like intuitive scientists? Second, do non-scientists really learn about their worlds by acting like intuitive scientists? And third, is thinking like an intuitive scientist something that itself has to be learned? And if so, how do people learn to think like that? To begin with, what is common to scientific thinking as a way of accumulating knowledge is the coordination of theories and evidence. Theories are interrelated ideas or models about how a system works, and they include ideas about causal relationships within the system. Now, theories are based on a body of evidence that we get from making observations. So at a minimum, working scientists can articulate their working assumptions or their theories. They can distinguish between what is a theory and what is evidence, and they can describe the kind of evidence that would support their theories, and they can also describe the kind of evidence that would raise problems for their theories. In other words, scientists can explain the process by which they've come to endorse a particular theory given the available evidence at any particular time in their field. Now, scientific progress in understanding a phenomenon like learning, for example, is made by positing some sort of model of the phenomenon, a theory. One example would be associative learning theories, which we discussed in the lectures on classical and operant conditioning. So this is the idea that learning is about forming associations, for example, between pushing a lever and receiving a pellet, and then coordinating models of associative learning with the evidence we see when we observe actual learning taking place. In other words, we have a model about how learning works, and then we test that model by making systematic observations, and we update the model based on those observations. Now, as we saw, that early associative learning model didn't pan out so well when we looked at the evidence that was accumulating. There were observations of learning in animals and people that weren't explained by associative learning theories. So given this description, are people like scientists? Do they coordinate theories and evidence? And is learning like the accumulation of scientific understandings? Now, one thing to note here is that this idea of people as scientists is stunningly different compared to that model of associative learning. And that's because everything about this notion that we're everyday scientists is at odds with associative learning. The metaphor of people as scientists involves us as being active creators of our own learning experience, and it relies heavily on an internal mental phenomenon, expectations we have about the world. Now, a researcher named Deanna Kuhn, in a very influential contribution to this area, laid out the main assumptions of the people as scientists theory of learning. And from her perspective, there really are two ways in which we can talk of people being like scientists in the way they learn. One way we can do this is to say that learning proceeds as people's models, the way they understand things to work, get supported or challenged by new evidence, and after that, confirmed or revised. This would mean science is a metaphor for the way people's understandings change, but it doesn't actually necessarily assume that people act like scientists as their models are being shifted. In a way, what Kuhn meant with this understanding is that if learning works this way, science-like learning would happen without necessarily involving deliberate thinking or awareness on the part of the person who's doing the learning. This is important. That is, it doesn't necessarily mean that the person actively goes out, formulates expectations and tests them, and then changes their understandings. That may seem somewhat confusing. So let me give you a concrete example. In my field, we admit graduate students to our program on a yearly basis. As we do so, we look at evidence about that student's potential in the form of their prior grades and their test scores and their entrance essays. And we base our theory about how that student will be as a researcher on the available evidence to us at the time. Some students are admitted and they join our program. Now, after they join our program, we have a lot of opportunities to gather new evidence about whether that student is a talented scientist or not. They conduct new research under our supervision, they write papers, and so on. Now, we might, in the face of that new evidence, revise our theory about whether the person is qualified to be a scientist or not. Over time, some students come to the program and they don't do as well as we might have expected based on their entrance data. We might say, so-and-so, he's kind of a bad student. But we wouldn't be aware that when so-and-so was admitted, we thought that he would be the next Einstein. Rather, we would just say, well, so-and-so's a bad student. And if someone were to ask us, well, what did you think when you admitted him? We might say, well, I had some doubts, I had some concerns. So in this way, our understanding is changing in response to facts, but we're not aware of it. We're not aware of that process of model revision, and we're not actively, consciously engaging in that process. The second way people might be like scientists is that they deliberately and consciously examine their theories or assumptions and the available evidence. One example of this comes from Chi's work, where people engaged in self-explanations that sometimes deliberately called up what they used to think and what they were seeing now in their class material. And this is also more like the way that real scientists work. They attempt to deliberately and consciously test their models against evidence. So, when people update their ideas about the world based on new experiences, do they do it like a scientist? The idea of self-explanations would certainly make it seem so. Participants in Chi's studies articulate explanations to themselves. They say, oh, I used to think that. Oh, really? And then they proceed to adapt their models to those provided in a textbook. Their self-explanations are a way of examining both the new evidence and the models they hold in their head in light of this new evidence. But when Kuhn and colleagues, as well as others, have looked more closely at the process of reasoning about theories and evidence, they found this is an acquired skill, and it's one that's quite difficult. So kids may have models of the world that change over time with their experience, but it doesn't necessarily occur in a conscious and scientist-like manner. Because to change a model like a scientist does is to take a fairly sophisticated approach to both evidence and theories. To investigate these issues, Kuhn and her collaborators often follow a relatively simple strategy. They elicit people's starting theories about a situation, and then they present them with evidence, and they ask them to put theory and evidence together. Sometimes they give participants confirmatory evidence, evidence that supports their pre-existing theories. Other times they give them disconfirming evidence, evidence that goes against their current theories. And the situations that they use involve things like whether variations in a tennis ball's color or coating cause better hitting, whether different kinds of foods cause people to get colds. So they're relatively simple and straightforward scenarios. And the evidence they present participants with can vary from evidence that is completely consistent or inconsistent with a theory to more complex probabilistic evidence where sometimes you get some support for your theory and sometimes you don't, something a little more typical of real science. And they look at participants who range in age from third graders, so 8, 9-year-olds, through adulthood. And this is kind of important, they also asked working scientists to engage in the tasks as well. So first, to think like a scientist, people have to distinguish between what is a theory and what is evidence, and then they have to coordinate the two in some way. One of the first things Kuhn and her colleagues observed in these initial studies was that people do not do well at distinguishing theories and evidence. For example, children asked about their theories in light of evidence might refer only to the evidence. They might say, well, some people who ate cake got colds. Or they might refer only to the theory, I think cakes cause colds. They seemed unaware that those were distinct things. For simple scenarios where all the evidence is consistent or inconsistent with the theory, ninth graders and college students did better. But as soon as evidence becomes only partially supportive, they also had difficulty distinguishing between theories and evidence. You may be thinking, not me. This is a problem for less than brilliant people and children. But I'm going to give you a kind of example of a failure to distinguish theory and evidence that we engage in all the time. When you go out to a park and you see people smiling and laughing and tossing a ball, you probably assume that those people are happy. But the fact is, what you're seeing is smiling, laughing, and tossing around a ball. You can't see happy. Happy is a theory about what those pieces of evidence mean. Now, in this example, it's a pretty safe theory. It's a theory that's probably right, but it's still a theory. And what I hope you can see through this example is that we all blur the difference between theories and evidence a lot in our everyday lives. Fortunately, working scientists had no difficulty distinguishing their starting expectations from the evidence. And that's important because it tells us that what we think is true about scientists is in fact true. And it further highlights the fact that what most of us are doing most of the time is not quite like what working scientists are doing. Now, after making this critical distinction between theories and evidence, people need some way to resolve contradictions between the two so that they can gain knowledge. And in Kuhn's work, sometimes people just ignore evidence that doesn't fit the theories they hold. For example, a participant who thinks the dark-colored balls produce better tennis strokes, when confronted with evidence that an equal number of dark balls resulted in poor hits versus good hits, is going to focus on the balls that resulted in good hits as confirming his or her theory, as supporting what he or she already believes. Now, this might not be so bad, because often a working theory that we hold is something we believe because of past evidence, and we don't really want to just toss out a perfectly workable model of the world after a single case where we got some evidence against our theory, even if it happened in Deanna Kuhn's lab, right? So it's true that working scientists also don't treat all evidence as equal. They also consider the way the evidence or the data were obtained and how these new pieces of evidence stack up against accumulated evidence. But what I just described about what working scientists do involves a deliberate decision to weight new evidence differently than established evidence, and a deliberate tendency to be conservative about revising theories. That's not what Kuhn saw. For Kuhn's participants, there is little sense of awareness that evidence is getting distorted. Participants actually seemed not to choose to discount some evidence by saying, well, I'm not sure that player was hitting right. Rather, they decided to just ignore it without seeming to be aware that they were ignoring conflicting evidence. People presented with disconfirming evidence might also revise their theories to fit the evidence, and this sounds like the right thing. That is, we should revise our theories in light of new evidence. But in Kuhn's work, participants seem to engage in this revision process not in a reflective way, rather in a kind of not very aware fashion. They simply shifted theories to match the evidence. So what participants did not say, for example, was, I guess I was wrong. I expected that the color of the ball would matter, but it doesn't. Rather, participants said, oh, color doesn't matter. Look, both dark and light balls got good hits, with no awareness that they previously had a different theory. And this is a lot like that example of what happens in my department when we admit a graduate student, get new evidence, change our minds about whether the person is a good or a bad scientist, and forget that we ever thought differently. Kuhn's findings in her early and her more recent work suggest that people do get better with age at distinguishing theories and evidence. And partly this appears to happen because of changes in their ability to process information at a pretty basic level, and we'll talk about those changes in more detail in a few lectures. Children are particularly weak at making the theory-evidence distinction, and adolescents are capable of doing so at somewhat more adult-like levels. Now, we also discussed last lecture that inquiry-based learning or discovery-based learning works better for adults, and this may be because they're more likely than children to be able to distinguish beliefs and theories from evidence, and that helps them to benefit more from experimenting directly and on their own. Children and adolescents, on the other hand, may need help drawing distinctions between theories and evidence, and they may need help to put the two together. But even adults retain some significant weaknesses in distinguishing theory from evidence. And this is particularly the case in more complex circumstances, where the evidence is mixed or the number of variables involved in a system is higher. Kuhn suggests that the cost of failing to distinguish theory and evidence is that our learning gets dominated by one or the other. That is, we're dominated by what we believe to be true, or we're dominated by what we're seeing, and we don't do the hard work of putting them together. And as we'll consider next, although sometimes people might be overly data or evidence-driven, it seems like it's more often the case that they're overly theory-driven. In other words, this is an area of learning where prior knowledge and prior beliefs don't just help us learn new information or engage in deeper processing. In fact, our prior knowledge, and especially our prior beliefs, can also distort our learning towards maintaining those beliefs. Even in the face of very good evidence, often we can't even imagine the kind of evidence that would change our beliefs. There's a question we don't ask ourselves: what would show me I am wrong? And if we're asked this question by others, we have a hard time coming up with an answer. We're very good, however, at articulating the reasons why we are right, and that's not the way a scientist, a good scientist, thinks. Kuhn's findings and concerns actually point to a phenomenon out of social psychology called confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the tendency for prior knowledge, beliefs, or theories to get maintained even in the face of contradictory evidence. Considering the different types of learning we've discussed so far, where might we find the strongest tendency for confirmation bias? Confirmation biases are relevant primarily to learning information and updating models of the world that are not purely linked to our direct experience, perhaps especially in various areas of science. And it's important to consider that self-explanations can certainly function to support or maintain our theories. We're good at holding on to understandings and models that we already have and already endorse. A classic piece of work on confirmation biases was done in the 1970s by Lord Ross and Lepper. And they recruited participants whose views on capital punishment differed. Some participants favored capital punishment because they believed it had a deterrence effect. Their theory was that having capital punishment led to lower rates of crime. Other participants were against capital punishment because they did not believe it had a deterrent effect. The researchers presented these participants with fictitious study results that supported a deterrent effect. For example, scientists have shown that murder rates in 8 of 10 states with capital punishment are significantly lower than in states without capital punishment. And they presented participants with studies that showed no evidence for deterrence. They asked participants to evaluate the quality of the studies and to report whether their own opinion changed as a result of reading both studies, the studies against and the studies for their preferred theory. Now, the overall effect of reading the evidence in the study should have been null, or even maybe have moved participants' beliefs to be more moderate and more close to one another, because everyone in the study read evidence in favor of their belief and evidence against their belief. But if we think about the findings of Kuhn, we can suspect that that wasn't the case, and we would be right. Participants were likely to interpret the evidence given to them in biased ways, such that both sets of participants came away with their prior beliefs strengthened. In other words, exposing people of different initial beliefs to the same body of mixed evidence led them to become more polarized in their opinions. Later work suggests that this is because people selectively apply their critical reasoning capabilities to evidence against their preferred theories. Paul Klaczynski and his colleagues looked at strongly held theories in high school and college students, and then presented them with confirming or disconfirming evidence. The theories, for example, might concern studying to music versus silence, and let me tell you, this is something that young adults and adolescents have strong opinions about. So when presented with confirming evidence, participants simply accepted the evidence. They didn't really think hard about whether that evidence was good or whether it was poorly done. But when they were presented with disconfirming evidence, evidence against their preferred beliefs, participants engaged the full weight of their reasoning faculties to discount that evidence. They explained why the study was faulty, badly done, had too small a sample size, used the wrong music, used the wrong media player, and so on. What changed from high school to college in Klaczynski's work was the sophistication of those reasoning strategies. And alas, what did not change was participants' selective use of those reasoning strategies to discount problematic evidence, to discount evidence that they didn't want to deal with, rather than to critically evaluate all the evidence, perhaps especially confirming evidence. My favorite example of this tendency comes from a paper by 3 judgment and decision-making researchers. I'm going to spare you the gory details, but suffice it to say that 2 of the researchers had opposing theories about a decision-making process and how it worked. And they decided to figure out a study that would provide evidence about which camp had the correct theory. They asked a 3rd person to serve as a collaborator and mediator because their relationship was actually somewhat hostile. They conducted the study, and as is often the case, the data were somewhat complicated and the evidence wasn't clearly favoring one theory over the other. And in the end, the collaborators each interpreted the study findings as supportive of their own view. The paper they published is called An Exercise in Adversarial Collaboration. But the larger point is that even highly trained scientists, when they're strongly committed to a theory, have a desire to interpret ambiguous data as supporting their own perspective. Now, I should note that these researchers are working scientists and they're good scientists, and they did shift their theories somewhat to accommodate the evidence, so they're not quite as biased as untrained college students. Confirmation biases are also evident in the arena of learning about ourselves, even though learning about ourselves is often explicitly modeled as a process of theory development and revision. And broadly speaking, we develop theories about what we're like and what others are like during adolescence and into young adulthood. These theories we have about what we're like draw on our experiences from infancy and our childhood as well, of course. And thereafter, when we have new experiences, they offer us evidence that either confirms what we believe to be true of ourselves or that contradicts what we think is true of ourselves based on information in those new experiences. That is, new experiences offer us an opportunity to learn that our existing views of ourselves are correct or that they need revision. But we're anything but objective and dispassionate about ourselves and our self-beliefs. So one general bias is that we all like to think well of ourselves, especially here in the United States. And so we often have a self-enhancing bias in the way we interpret evidence from our experiences. So researchers have documented that we explain bad things that happen in our lives by appealing to circumstances or external factors, and we're very happy and very easily take credit for the good things that we do as coming from us and who we are. But the analogous bias to confirmation biases that I've been talking about has been actually examined more extensively by a researcher named Bill Swann. And Swann rightly points out that the most compelling evidence for confirmation biases about oneself is actually found in people who view themselves negatively. In a variety of studies, Swann has shown that people with negative self-views tend to selectively ignore positive feedback about themselves. They prefer romantic partners who view them similarly negatively, and they actually stay with such partners longer than they stay with partners who view them positively. If they enter college and have a roommate, over the first year that they're with that roommate, they get the roommate to view them negatively. and so on. So they have a variety of ways in which they end up maintaining their negative beliefs about themselves. They'd rather be right than feel good. Now, Swann points out that for self-views or theories about ourselves, it's easy to become trapped in the negative images of self that some people have if you think about all these strategies for ignoring feedback that you're actually not such a bad person. Beyond the self, confirmation biases are a real obstacle for learning more broadly, and further, they're a legitimate issue of concern to policymakers. There are many, many studies that look at problems with people's ability to modify their theories and beliefs in response to evidence, and they're overwhelmingly conclusive. We maintain our strongly held beliefs in spite of contradictory evidence, and unfortunately, we are not highly aware of how we're doing this. And worse yet, we tend to view those with contradictory opinions as wrong. Where things are particularly fraught, from my perspective, are the arenas where public decision-making and science intersect. Areas like climate change and healthcare policies. These are arenas where at least some aspects of our decision-making should be informed by scientific evidence. And that means that the public and their elected officials need to be able to coordinate theories and evidence. And beyond even those issues are the intergroup conflicts in the world that get exacerbated by both sides believing that they are right and the other side is deluded. This is because confirmation bias goes along with some other pernicious biases known as naive realism and bias blind spot. Naive realism is the tendency we have to see our own theories and beliefs as corresponding to reality. That is, not as theories at all, but simply as facts. In fact, naive realism goes exactly along with Kuhn's findings that people don't distinguish very well between theories and evidence because they view their theories as facts, and facts are, after all, a form of evidence. Further, if my theories aren't theories, but they're actually facts, then it doesn't make sense to change my theory in response to conflicting facts at all. Bias blind spot, on the other hand, is the tendency we have to see others as biased. Based on naive realism, of course, we are completely unbiased. In fact, we're actually rather good at spotting other people's mistakes in reasoning and other people's biases in interpreting evidence. So this brings me to the last issue for today's lecture. Can people learn to better coordinate theories and evidence? And if so, how? There are strong links between education and the ability to do so. And as trained scientists generally can do this, it seems possible to train people to think like scientists about theories and evidence more broadly. And it seems plausible that people could adopt strategies to prevent confirmation biases. Notably, however, scientific training and acumen in one arena don't always generalize. Not everyone with scientific training applies that training to other aspects of their lives. Linus had some crazy ideas about vitamin C, for example. So trying to help reduce confirmation bias tendencies won't be easy. Different proposals about how to do this target different issues. One of the most obvious is just to educate people about confirmation biases. Does educating people about the biases reduce their likelihood of falling prey to such biases? Well, to some extent, yes. One approach developed by Klozinski involves a kind of cognitive therapy-like approach. Participants are shown their biases in reasoning, and they're educated about the general phenomenon of confirmation bias and some of its pitfalls. They're then asked to try to reason about evidence from the opposing viewpoint. And following this intervention, participants are asked to reason about a different issue to test the generalizability of what they've learned. Preliminary results are encouraging. Klozinski argues participants did not learn the skills of scientific reasoning, rather they learned some information and techniques to ensure that they employed those skills generally, rather than only when they want to argue against evidence. Other attempts at debiasing people include a consider the opposite approach. In this approach, you ask people to imagine the opposite of what they believe, or the opposite of what their own findings suggest. This has had some moderate success in some studies. A different direction might be to enhance training in scientific thinking applied to everyday issues at the K-12 educational level. And right now, our approach to training in scientific thinking is concentrated more heavily in the advanced and collegiate settings, and it's fairly domain-specific. It happens within disciplines like chemistry, psychology, or biology. And a general understanding of how to think like a scientist might be useful to people more broadly if it was taught in a way that involved applications to everyday life. This may be especially important in light of the increasing exposure to opinion, evidence, and mixtures thereof in our multimedia information overloaded age. Now, a healthy skepticism about our own ability to judge our own and others' beliefs is probably a good thing to cultivate. And if you really want to think like a scientist in an ideal way, cultivate a habit of asking yourself, how might I be wrong? What fact or observation would show me that my idea here is actually not correct? All of the types of interventions that have been examined recently by researchers have in common an effort to move people from what might be called lazy, low-effort reliance on their prior beliefs to more deliberate, rule-oriented evaluations of evidence and theory. In fact, the idea that there are two modes of thinking, a lower and a higher effort version, will be something we'll return to in the next lecture, where we will weigh some commonalities and differences across different types of learning that we have examined in this part of the course, and we'll think about broader implications for how we learn.